It was dark outside. I was walking home from school. The moon shined bright and was hyper-realistic. As I was walking, I noticed an evil-looking store hidden in a dark alley. I walked in and started looking around. It was a game store. I eventually found a copy of a game called BloodyDeath.Exe, and I was instantly interested. The cartridge it was on was dirty and looked rusty. Its name looked like it was written in blood. Then suddenly the owner of the store emerged from the dark. His arm and legs were missing and replaced with hooks. His face was destroyed. He had no ears or nose and only one eye. His skin was burned and his guts were hanging out of his stomach. He looked at me in terror and said, "No, please don't buy that game." He kept begging me and started crying hyper-realistic blood. He looked at me and his eyes were now bloodshot. "Please don't play the game, you will die." He then took a gun and shoot himself in the head. Blood went everywhere. I was mildly disturbed, but I ended up buying the game anyway. As I walked out of the store, I could hear the screams from hell. Bloody skinless heads burst out of the ground, and I could hear thousands of screaming voices telling me not to play. Then the store collapsed into the ground. The place where the store once stood was now a massive pit of blood, and massive flames were jetting out of it. Dead bodies were everywhere. I was slightly more disturbed by this experience, but I continued. I went home. When I arrived at home, I went straight to my room, and I put the game cartridge into my PC. The game turned on, but something was wrong. It was just a black screen. I waited for 15 years, but finally the game turned on. I was so exhausted I ripped half of my face off and hyper-realistic blood poured out. I threw half of my face across the room and it splattered across the wall, spilling more hyper-realistic blood. A notification popped up on my Xbox. It said, "If you play this game, you will be sent to hell and die in pain." The only option was OK, so I pressed OK. The computer crashed for a bit, but then it turned back on. The menu of the game was complete. There was only one option, and it was continue, and it looked like it was written in blood. I was confused as I had not played the game before, but I had no other choice than press continue. The game loaded in. It was a platformer like Super Mario. The background was complete black and with blood-red clouds. The ground was made from blood-covered bricks. The character I was playing looked just like me, but the only difference was that their eyes were black and they were crying blood. My Game Boy trembled in my hands as I shook in fear. I pressed forward on my iPad and the character walked forward. I walked for 12.436 for 6 seconds. Until I came across a pit filled with long sharp spikes. The spike pit was filled with mutilated bodies of innocent creatures. Blood was everywhere, and I screamed in terror. This sight was so horribly horrible with horrid horribleness, I could not stop myself, and I puked everywhere. The vomit flew out of me so fast it went out of my window and onto a homeless man walking beside my house. When the vomit hit him, it burned his skin off. The homeless man's eyes turned black, and he started crying hyper-realistic blood. When he screamed, it sounded just like a real person screaming. But what happened next was even more shocking. I tried jumping over the pit, but I ended up falling in it. The moment I hit the spikes, my character screamed in pain as he was impaled. But the worst of all, I could feel all of it like if it was real. The pain was so great, I let out a hyper-realistic scream, and then I shit myself so hard the poop came out of my butt so fast it tore a hole, and then bounced around my house like a speeding bullet shoot by a crazy murderer trying to kill an innocent child. The poop eventually found its way outside and hit the homeless man, who was still screaming and bleeding hyper-realistic blood in pain. When the poop hit the homeless man, something utterly horrifying happened. The homeless man exploded into a cloud of hyper-realistic blood, and then a hyper-realistic skeleton crying hyperplastic blood come out of the cloud of hyper-realistic blood. The skeleton looked at me with pure anger in his eyes, and what happened next made my blood boil so hard it boiled through my skin, and then it melted its way to the core of the earth. Was it strangled an innocent toddler, causing it to cry hyper-realistic blood? The skeleton said, "I am your dog." But that was impossible. Me dog died 145 years ago. This thought scared me so much I peed myself. The pee come out of me so fast it was like a laser that was wanting to decapitate an innocent old lady. The pea cut the skeleton in half, but then I realized something horrifying. I was peeing hyper-realistic blood. I tried screaming, but only static came out. Then a loud voice that sounded like the devil from hell said in loud words, "Finish the game, or you die in real life." I was so scared I wept hyper-realistic blood. But I had no other choice, I had to finish the game. By this point my character had respawned. Now he had only 2 lives left. I screamed, but only hyper-realistic static came out. Then I realized that my lives looked like hyper-realistic hearts. Almost like somebody had ripped out a heart of an innocent school child and used it as a live for this dread putrid game. As I pressed forwards, I came across the spike pit again. This time it was filled to the brim with dead bodies. I walked over the dead bodies. I eventually walked into a desert filled with blood-red sand. The clouds were now gone, and it was almost completely pitch black. As I was walking forward, a horrible creature walked into my room. I screamed in utter terror as this horrible creature walked towards. I started in terror as it spoke, "Do your homework, or I will disown you." Then I came to a terrifying conclusion. The horrible creature was in fact my mother. But that was impossible. It was 2011, but my mother died in 2098. This though hurt me so much I started crying hyper-realistic blood. The creature known as my mother was now walking towards me. It opened its horrible mouth again. "Stop playing video games and do your homework." This sentence horrified me even more. I was now bleeding from every hole and pore in my body. Eventually the horrible creature crawled out of my room, and I quickly locked the door. I went back to playing the game, but something horrible had changed. The character was now staring straight at the screen, and hyper-realistic blood was coming out of his mouth. I screamed, and my scream sounded hyper-realistic. I then vomited because of how awful it was. Then 666 and a pentagram flashed across the screen. The character was no longer looking at me. I continued playing the game. I eventually came across another pit. This one was filled with the flames from hell. I tried jumping over this pit, just like I tried jumping over the spike pit. I was able to get to the other side, but then the character stopped moving. He turned his head towards me and flipped me off, very inappropriate, and then jumped into the flame pit. I screamed in pain again as the character was burning to death. I could feel all the pain. Visible burn marks appeared in my skin. This was no longer fake, this was real. I threw my phone across the room. I didn't want to play the game anymore, but then I felt a strong force. I couldn't do anything, it forced me to pick up my PS1, and I was forced to keep playing the game. The character was now in a dark void. He had only 1 life left. But before I could keep playing, the skin turned blood red and weird satanic symbols flashed across the screen. Then I heard a knock on the door. I turned around exactly 120 degrees to face the door. I stood up at exactly 9:23 p.m. I started approaching the door at exactly 17 meters per second. My first step moved 12.45 meters from its original position. My second step was now 13.147 meters from the previous position. My third step was 837.45 meters from the original Soitan. I then arrived at the door and opened it. What I was in front of me scares me to this day. It was 475 for 3859, 853 for 7735 for 93 for 95735 for 7653 for 395 for 75 dead bodies. I vomited puke, and then I started peeing hyper-realistic pee. There was blood everywhere, and the smell was awful. Every single body fluid leaked out of my every pore in a hyper-realistic way. I closed the door and run back to the game. Before I could touch my nose, everything turned black. I was in a block void. The character from the game was standing in front of me. His eyes were black, and he was crying hyper-realistic blood. I started at him for a few seconds. Then he took out a knife. He started chasing me, and I started running. He started getting closer and closer to me. But I eventually remembered he had only 1 life left. I turned around and punched as hard as I could. The character lost his life instantly and dropped dead to the ground, but then I realized something. The character's head was actually a mask. I took it off, and it was my father. I then looked at myself and realized I was the character. I had 0 lives left. Then I looked and saw what looked like a massive window. But it was actually a television screen. I was inside the video game, and the person who was now playing the game was the character from the video game. My brother walked into the room. He asked if everything was okay, and the video game character responded in my voice. I screamed, but only static came out. The video game character then smiled with a hyper-realistic smile, and blood poured out of his pitch-black eyes. He took out a knife and then turned off the game. The last thing I saw was darkness consuming me.
But then I woke up. It was all a dream. But as I got up, I noticed somebody was sleeping beside me. I come up closer to them to see who it was. It was the character from the video game.
Hey, yo, the here. Oh!